Hello, and welcome back to the Rail Cinema. Today, we'll be taking a look at some of the very last EMDs on Canadian passenger trains, and ultimately some of the last EMDs on any passenger trains that can be found in North America. We'll begin our rail journey in Canada's largest population and economic centre, the city of Toronto. To those outside of what many may call the politest country in the world, it may come as a surprise that Canada, in its largest city of Toronto, has a lot more than just friendly faces and a love for Tim Hortons. In fact, Toronto is a bustling railroad hub, with nearly non-stop freight and passenger trains at every hour of the day. In the last several decades, the Greater Toronto Area has grown exponentially as a creative, financial, and manufacturing hub, and as such, so has its population. Faced with the problem of unprecedented growth and consequently severely overstressed highways, the Ontario government formed a commuter rail system in 1967 to test if regional passenger rail was a viable alternative to the personal automobile for people commuting from their homes in the suburbs to work in the city. This commuter rail system, known as GO Transit, was an astounding success, carrying 1 million passengers within just 4 months of its inauguration. Today, GO Transit is the 4th busiest commuter railroad in North America, but it wouldn't be here without the help of EMD in the EMD F59PH. Electromotive Division, commonly referred to as EMD, was the locomotive division of General Motors and was largely responsible for the success of the diesel-electric locomotive. Just as Ford was to the American people with its Model T, EMD was to the railroads, dominating the locomotive market for decades. In 1987, after 20 years of growing success in regional rail, GO Transit found itself with an aging fleet of mostly inherited CN equipment. With the need to modernize the railroad to lead it into the 21st century, GO turned to EMD, who responded with the F59PH. GO was the launch customer of the F59PH, taking delivery of 49 locomotives between 1988 and 1994. Based on the frame, mechanical, and electrical components of a GP60 general-purpose freight locomotive, with the streamlined cowl body of the wildly successful F40 popularized by Amtrak and VIA Rail, the F59PH featured a unique safety cab design, making the locomotive easily distinguishable by its triclop-style window arrangement. The locomotive packed in a 12-cylinder, 3,000 horsepower diesel engine that could get 10 of GO's heavy bi-level passenger cars up to track speed in 75 seconds. Back in 2009, GO began retiring the F59s upon taking delivery of the new, more powerful and reliable MPI-style engines seen among some of our old stallions here. Willowbrook Yard is GO's primary maintenance facility. This massive complex is responsible for servicing dozens of trains a day. Not only is this facility home to GO, but it's also VIA Rail's second largest yard, responsible for servicing the famed Canadian service running cross-continent from Toronto to Vancouver, as well as VIA's intercity corridor trains, like this train seen here, led by another example of classic EMD power, the F40. We'll come back and take a look at VIA's operations in the infamous EMD F40 in just a bit, but by now some of you die-hard rail fans are probably aware that the F40, as well as GO's F59s, are not technically EMD locomotives. You see, back in 1950, the Canadian government imposed heavy import taxes on the American-built EMD locomotives that Canadian railroads wanted, leading GM in a search to circumvent these charges. As demand was high enough to justify, their solution was to establish a dedicated manufacturing plant in London, Ontario. All locomotives produced here were virtually identical in design and spec to their American counterparts, besides for the fact that they would be under the label GMDD, General Motors Diesel Division, instead of EMD. For the sake of clarity, many refer to both manufacturers interchangeably, as the designs are ultimately EMD, and as many GMDD engines inevitably found themselves on American railroads by the end of their careers. By 2011, nearly all of GO's F59s had been retired in favor of the modern MP40s that dominate the railroad's roster today. However, GO opted to retain and rebuild 8 locomotives, numbers 557 through 564, to supplement the expanding commuter service as backup power, and are the last that remain in Toronto. Most rail fans probably expected that all of GO's F59s would have been phased out by now, thanks to delivery of new Tier 4 emissions-compliant MP54s. However, as a duo of F59s race the replacement into Toronto, you can see that's not the case. Thanks to one major shortcoming of the new MPI locomotives, and a push from politicians in an attempt to win voters in Ontario's less populous centres, GO has found a need for the F59s on its most bizarre route. Beginning in fall 2021, GO began a pilot service between Toronto and London that has ultimately become a permanent addition to GO's operations. The 4-hour journey is certainly unusual for a commuter train, as it acts more as an intercity service, supplementing VIA Rail's quarter trains, albeit in a much slower but more affordable fashion. Due to weight restrictions on the low-priority CN subdivision that the route traverses, the new MPI locomotives are too heavy to proceed past Kitchener, making the F59s the only locomotive on GO's roster capable of pulling this unusual train through southwest Ontario. For now, it seems that the EMD F59PHs are here to stay with GO Transit. However, GO has been seeking to electrify all of its trains to improve service speed, efficiency, and reliability, whilst reducing their environmental impact and maintenance costs. As of just this year, GO has received funding to begin this massive infrastructure project, with completion expected by the mid-2030s. This will likely spell the end for all diesel locomotives pulling GO trains, including the last of the F59s. However, that's not to say these workhorses won't find themselves onto other railroads, as many already have. Just outside of downtown Montreal, we await one of VIA Rail's famous J trains, or joint trains, bound for northern Quebec, where the trains will split and head even deeper into the uninhabited wilderness of northern Canada. Here, we'll watch as the J train meets one of Montreal's EXO commuter trains in a showing of classic EMD power. On nearly all of its rural routes, VIA Rail employs beautiful 1950s stainless steel bud cars that are quite a treat to witness in the 21st century. At the time of filming, the structural integrity of this vintage equipment is being questioned, and the Government of Canada has mandated that VIA Rail employ buffer cars to protect passengers in the event of a crash. The last rail car on this train is a Chateau-style sleeper car from Canadian Pacific's original order of Bud sleepers that VIA Rail inherited. These cars are rarely, if never used at all anymore, so it is very neat to catch one practically dragged out of retirement to be used as a buffer car on a route that does not offer sleeper service. EXO, although not nearly as large as GO Transit, is Canada's second largest commuter railroad and employs a fleet of 10 EMD F59PHs that it acquired from GO Transit at its foundation. The days left for these classic EMDs are numbered, as EXO expects delivery of new Siemens Charger locomotives to replace them within the coming years. Montreal is Canada's second most populous city. Located in the proudly French-speaking province of Quebec, the city is an international railroad hub due to its relatively close proximity to the USA's eastern ports. It comes as no surprise that the city has a rich rail history, and EXO is no exception to that. Formerly known as AMT, EXO was founded in 1997 to provide commuter rail service after taking over some of the oldest CN and CP commuter railroads. EXO was probably best known for operating one of the few electrified rail lines in North America, outside of the Northeast Corridor, which ceased service in 2020 to allow for the construction of the new Montreal REM, which will use the old right-of-way and act more as a high-frequency metro service than as a commuter railroad. Besides for their small fleet of former GO F59PHs that are slated for retirement, EXO also employs a modernized version of their former GO units, the EMD F59PH. Satisfied with their purchase of the F59PH from GO Transit, and with the need for more trains thanks to their unexpected success amongst regional commuters, EXO placed an order with EMD for 11 F59PHIs that it took delivery of between 2000 and 2001. The EMD F59PHI, although visually nothing like its predecessor to the untrained eye, is very similar to the F59PH. The new version used the same platform as its outgoing sister, but featured minor technical differences, such as 200 additional horsepower, bringing the total power output up to 3,200 horsepower thanks to a new prime mover. This new diesel engine was also environmentally friendlier, making it popular amongst railroads required to meet new emissions regulations. The F59PHI could also reach speeds of up to 110 miles per hour, although few ever did in active service, thanks to its unmistakable change in appearance. Built on the original frame as the PH, the PHI took advantage of a new streamlined car body design that provided significant weight reductions. new locomotive was not only a technical upgrade, but was also much more pleasant for engineers and crews thanks to a quiet, isolated cab design. The F59PHIs built for EXO were some of the last ever built, as production ceased in 2001 as a result of increasingly stringent emissions regulations. Just like their older sisters, the Canadian variants of these locomotives were also technically of GMDD descent. After more than 20 years, they are still commonplace on the commuter railroad and act as the backbone of the fleet, carrying thousands of passengers daily in the greater Montreal area. Although it is safe to say they will be around for at least a few more years here in Quebec, EXO is not the only Canadian employer of the F59PHI. Meandering through the rugged terrain of stunning western British Columbia, we find ourselves along the shores of the Vancouver Harbor as we await a Vancouver-bound commuter train, the West Coast Express. Established in 1995 as a faster alternative to driving, the West Coast Express operates one line that connects suburban commuters to downtown Vancouver. The small commuter railroad is the only one of its kind in Western Canada, and almost exclusively employs EMD F59PHIs for power. West Coast Express was the first Canadian railroad to operate the PHI, and was one of the first customers of the locomotive in North America, purchasing 5 engines shortly after the state of California placed their initial order with EMD for the very first PHIs in 1994. The F59PHI was the last great passenger locomotive produced by EMD under GM, as EMD was sold off in 2005, and now does business as Progress Rail. By now, rail fans will have realized that we haven't really covered what many may consider the most significant EMD locomotive of all, the F40, and its last great employer, VIA Rail Canada. Making its way across the North American continent, traversing 5 provinces in 4 days, from the scenic shores of Vancouver, British Columbia, to the bustling metropolis of Toronto, Ontario, the Canadian is truly one of the world's last great trains. Comprised of vintage stainless steel bud cars that are so well kept they appear seemingly frozen in the 1950s, the Canadian is a time capsule on rails, taking passengers back to a time when transcontinental railroading was king. On board, you can enjoy a cozy private bedroom, fresh, delicious meals prepared by onboard chefs, and views from the vintage dome cars to take in the wild Canadian wilderness that you would otherwise never get a chance to see. With a train so clearly frozen in time, it is only fitting that there is none other than classic EMD power at the helm, in the form of VIA's iconic F40s. Like some of VIA Rail's other rural serving routes, along certain parts of the journey, the Canadian can be flagged down trackside, to load and unload passengers venturing off the grid. VIA Rail, Canada's government-funded national railroad, is probably best known amongst rail fans for their eclectic roster of equipment that cannot be found anywhere else in the 21st century. Here at Willowbrook Yard in Toronto, where VIA services and maintains the Canadian and corridor trains, we can get a taste for that. LRC coaches, identifiable by their low-profile design, like those we can see here shoving back into the yard, can only be found on VIA Rail, currently acting as the backbone of VIA's corridor fleet. In addition to pulling long-haul and rural trains, VIA uses the EMD F40s to supplement their GE power commonly found on the corridor. The Windsor-Toronto-Ottawa-Montreal Rail Corridor is VIA's moneymaker and busiest route, as most of the Canadian population lives within this region. Here at the yard, one of VIA's rebuilt EMD F40PH-2Ds prepares to deadhead a train to Toronto's Union Station, where it will board passengers en route to Montreal. VIA Rail took deliveries of their 59 F40PH-2Ds between 1986 and 1989 to replace their aging fleet of inherited CN and CP EMD F units and ALCO, or in Canada's case MLW FPAs, which were long past their useful service life. Like the other EMD locomotives we've looked at, VIA Rail's F40s were built in London, Ontario, under the GMDD name, and produced up to 3,200 horsepower at speeds of up to 95 miles per hour. They were deployed system-wide, bringing modern necessities that their outgoing predecessors lacked, like head-end power, allowing the locomotives to act as generators to supply electricity to passenger cars. As well as retiring the F units and FPAs, the F40s helped alleviate the heavy strain on corridor services, thanks to the relatively new LRC locomotives that accompanied the LRC passenger sets, being less reliable than expected. In 2007, as the F40s were starting to show their age, rather than purchase new locomotives to replace them as Amtrak had done a decade or so earlier, VIA Rail received funding to complete a comprehensive rebuild program that would revitalize the classic EMDs for another generation of service. This rebuild would most notably optimize the head-end power systems for increased efficiency and quieter operations, and would see locomotives painted into VIA's Renaissance scheme, like number 6411, seen here working a J train in tandem with a GE P42 on a corridor service out of Toronto. On some services, VIA will place a locomotive on either end of a train, where turning a train around, or Y-ing in railroad terms, can be difficult or time-consuming. For instance, this inbound train from Windsor has a P42 leader, but one of VIA's flashy, silver and gold-wrapped F40s taking up the rear. To commemorate VIA Rail's 40th anniversary, several locomotives and coaches were specially wrapped to celebrate the occasion in this bright, eye-catching scheme. Although the 40th anniversary markings have been removed and replaced with "Love the Way" in English and French, many engines and coaches still adorn the shiny wrap, including 8 F40s. VIA Rail doesn't own the vast majority of the tracks it operates over, instead receiving permission from the host railroads to use their right-of-ways. This can often lead to delays and sticky situations for VIA Rail, as host railroads are not obligated to prioritize VIA trains. Here in Toronto, that's exactly what we got a chance to witness firsthand. Many believe VIA trains are only hindered by the freight railroads. However, as a VIA train inbound from Montreal approaches the municipalities of Toronto on GO Transit trackage, we can see that's not the case. If you've ever wondered what a train traffic jam looked like, well, here you go. As commuter trains storm out of Scarborough GO Station, it looks like VIA has the middle track all to itself. However, take a closer look at the signals. As this GO train clears the northernmost main line, the one to our left, the middle track signal will show as a limited clear, providing instructions to another train heading towards our VIA train. To the untrained eye, it may appear as if these trains are headed on a crash course, but take a look at the switches, the weird maze of track up ahead. As the GO train inches closer and closer to our VIA train, it'll diverge and cross over onto the northernmost track, before diverging once again to head north. Finally, as the tracks ahead open up, our train can proceed in towards Toronto. But just as all the traffic looks as if it's cleared up, another VIA train inbound from Ottawa approaches a control point. The dispatcher has aligned our train from Montreal on the north track for a straight shot into Toronto. So as it switches over, it'll have to make our already late Ottawa train wait for it to clear the block before it can proceed. Finally, with no other holdups, our last train caught up in the traffic jam can proceed towards its terminus in downtown Toronto. The future of the EMD F40 on Canadian rails is uncertain. Although they've found success in second-hand service amongst tourist rail operators, their days pulling via trains appears numbered. As of the recording of this video, VIA Rail has just begun operating its new Scenes Charger locomotives and venture sets, like those found on Brightline and Amtrak Midwest and California trains, that are expected to completely replace VIA Rail's eclectic corridor fleet in the coming years. Although we will still find the F40s in use on VIA's long-distance trains like the famed Canadian for a little while longer, VIA Rail's entire fate has been questioned. As of just a few weeks ago, the Government of Canada has decided to privatize the majority of intercity passenger rail, which will ultimately push VIA Rail out of most of the services it operates. VIA Rail will continue to operate its financially challenged long-distance routes, but many have called into question how long those routes will last under the railroad without the financial subsidies provided by its corridor services. Nevertheless, it is a real pleasure to witness these historic trains in the 21st century, and I hope you've enjoyed witnessing them too. If you'd like to see more content like this, please consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks so much for joining me on today's adventure. Goodbye for now and have a great day.